So let's go.
Hi everyone, I'm José Mayub and host José Mayub Path Chepsen channel. Today's interview is a very special one. It's a great privilege and an honor to welcome Professor John Dunn. This conversation is stated as a small contributor to his intellectual career will be conducted with collaboration with the Department of History and the University of São Paulo, my mother language, USP, and the História Pirata podcast. Representing USP, I invite Felipe, that the co-host of this interview, to introduce himself, Philip, sorry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Felipe Oliveira Bergonço. I'm a master's candidate in social history at the University of São Paulo. It is a pleasure to be back here, especially to co-host this conversation, this very special conversation. Thank you for the invitation, José.
Professor Dan, it's an honor having you here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Guys, firstly, to brief introduction in Professor John Dunn. Professor John Dunn is one of the most influential historians, political thought, and political theorists of the past half century. Emeritus Professor of Political Theory at the University of Cambridge and the Fellow of the British Academy. Dunn's scholarship has profoundly shaped the study of political ideas, democracy, revolution, and its theory of political thought. His landmark work, The Political Thought of John Locke, 6-9, transformative Locke, studied by situated political argues with their historical and intellectual context, helping to establish a methodological approach closely associated with the Cambridge tradition of intellectual history. Throughout his career, has combined rigorous historical scholarship with sustained reflection on contemporary political problems, particularly democracy, political obligation, trust, relation, and the challenges of political judgment.
Beyond his foundational contributions to Locke scholarship, Professor Dunn has produced an extraordinary body of work spanning more than 6 decades, including influential books such as Modern Revolutions, Western Political Theory in the Face of Future, Political Obligation in its historical context, and Setting the People Free, The Story of Democracy, among many others. His research has explored the evolution of political ideas across different civilizations, the nature and limits of democratic government, the politics of post-colonial Africa, and the global history of political thought. Recognized internationally through prestigious lectureships, honorary appointments, and the Sir Isaiah Burley Prize for lifetime contribution to political studies. Dunn remains a central figure in contemporary political theory. His work continues to influence historians, philosophers, political scientists, and students of democracy across the world. With that background in mind, I believe this will be a highly fruitful discussion. Let's start with our first question. This first section will be devoted to some biographical questions, biographical reflections. First one is, Professor Dunn, what first drew you to the study of the history of ideas? And looking back on your early intellectual journey, how influential was Peter Laslett in shaping not only your interest in John Locke, but also the foundations of what would become the so-called Cambridge approach to the history of political ideas?
Well, I'll try and explain what happened. Basically, I became really interested in the history of political thought in my last year as an undergraduate at Cambridge. And I did so because there was a very brilliant piece of teaching for about 2/5 of the final year history course, a special subject on the Scottish Enlightenment, taught by Duncan Forbes. And it was brilliantly taught. It's a magnificent subject. He managed to show how incredibly important that episode in the intellectual history in the first instance of Scotland was for the world from then on. So it was a brilliant piece of teaching. It was intensely exciting. And I hadn't really thought I particularly wanted to go on studying after I'd finished my undergraduate degree until then. And I didn't really, I can't say that I was completely certain that I wanted to do so even then, But I certainly, what I hoped to do when I started off studying the history of political ideas was to study a topic which had arisen directly out of that course, the way in which the Scottish philosopher David Hume thought about political obligation. And the reason I wanted to study that was because I thought it was a surprisingly inadequate way of thinking about political obligation, given the astonishing brilliance of so many of Hume's other ideas. So it was an anomaly in the thought of Hume which had really caught my attention, and I was hoping to study it with Duncan Forbes as my supervisor. If you do a postgraduate degree, it's overwhelmingly important how you are supervised. Well, I wasn't supervised by Duncan Forbes because Duncan Forbes was at that point trying to write his great life work, which was a work about Hume, and he was quite an anxious man. He was a great war hero. So, I mean, you don't want to get the wrong idea from his being anxious, but he was quite an anxious man. And the last thing he wanted, he was finding it difficult to get what he wanted to say about Hume fully into focus. And he thought the last thing he wanted while trying to do so was a silly young person cluttering up the foreground. And so he passed me on to Peter Laslett. Now, Peter Laslett was a very different person. Peter Laslett was not an anxious person. He was the very opposite of an anxious person. He was a great enthusiast. He had innumerable different sorts of enthusiasms, but one of his enthusiasms was the history of political ideas, and he just published his celebrated edition of Locke's Two Treatises of Government, one of Locke's two central works about politics, and which showed that actually the beliefs people had about Locke, about that work and what had occasioned it were wrong, and tried to suggest how it should be understood differently because of the circumstances which had actually prompted Locke to write it. I wasn't going to work myself on Locke at all. What I was going to do, because that is what Laslett wanted me to do and told me to do, was to study what happened to Locke's Two Treatises of Government across the world, which in practice meant across Britain, Europe, Ireland, I suppose, which is not part of Britain really, in any sense, and North America and continental Europe. In the century leading up to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, obviously in different order, and the failure of Britain to experience a revolution at the same time. So Laslett thought that was very, very interesting. He was interested in it himself, knew quite a lot about it, and he said, you are to go off and do that. And I wasn't wildly enthusiastic about the assignment, but I thought it was bound to have some interesting stuff in it. I was very interested in revolutions myself. It's important to know that I was much more interested in politics before I got to Cambridge than I was in history, and that I studied history at Cambridge because you couldn't study politics at that time. It wasn't a university course. In that sense, I was a historian essentially by accident. But I was a historian, that's what I was trying to be. And I obviously thought a lot about how to be a historian in relation to the sorts of subject matter I was studying. And I didn't start off in any sense at all trying to imitate anyone else's approach to it, but I did start at the same time as someone who was who became a very close friend and is still a very close friend, and who has had a very large effect on the way the history of political thought is understood across the world, Quentin Skinner. And we worked together in our researches, and we talked to each other endlessly, and we read each other's work. We, in a sense, thought together about what we were doing. And Quentin, who is a much more organized and disciplined person than I am, wrote about how he thought you should do it at great length, on many different occasions, and worked out a sort of program for how to do it, and tried to show that that was the way to do it, and any other way of doing it was mistaken. Well, that wasn't really what I was trying to do. I was really trying to think about how to do my own work. And I knew the sort of things I was interested in, and I knew what I was trying to understand. And I became very interested in the question of how to do what I was trying to do, because I noticed something which was not supposed to be part of my research, my PhD talk, which was something about the way in which Locke thought about politics in the context of the two treatises of government. I noticed something about the way he argued, and I became very, very interested in that, and I tried to work out how it worked. I tried to understand what he was doing and why he was doing it. And it happens to be the case that there are unusually good opportunities to understand that in the case of Locke, because Locke left an enormous amount of evidence about how he did so. He left a great mass of, he didn't throw things away, and he left a great mass of written material, most of which had not been published at that point, but which was available for study in various places around the world, but particularly at that point in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And I spent a lot of time working through it and trying to understand what he was doing and why he was doing it that way. So when I was thinking about the history of ideas as an activity, I was thinking about it from and through that sort of experience, and I was trying to show what made sense of that sort of approach. And the point of the identity of history of ideas was I wanted to force through one particular argument, which is that actually there is simply one history of ideas, but it's very, very complicated, and you can't capture what it is, what it has been, in any simple way. No one can. It's not possible to do so. It doesn't make sense to think that you could. It's not an epistemically practicable enterprise to do so. But I also thought, and this was partly sort of competitiveness with my contemporaries at Oxford, who did it in a very different way and were very confident about the excellence of their way of approaching it. And I thought actually their way of approaching it didn't really make sense. And Quentin thought the same. So both of us were trying to show that as well as whatever else we were trying to show. We were very young, no doubt in many ways, as it were, very silly, or anyway, differently silly from any ways in which we're silly now. It was a sort of young person's approach. But anyway, in trying to show that it must be true that there'd just been one history of ideas, I was trying to show what that meant, in a way, practically, if you were trying to understand a bit of it. And what I think I hope still I managed to show is that if you want to study the history of ideas and you are sane enough to recognize that there was just one history of ideas, what you need to do is to think about it for yourself as you go along, by asking questions about it and trying to see the answers, find out the answers to those questions. And I thought, actually, if you're doing anything else, that ultimately will not make sense. It may, be the conventional thing to do at a particular time and place, but it actually won't make sense. So that particular article, which was a very aggressive article, I suppose, in many ways, and I suppose therefore still is a very aggressive article, was really trying to, to settle something. It wasn't trying to settle how everyone else should behave. It followed from what I thought it showed, that there isn't actually a general recipe for behaving. It doesn't make sense to think that there is. But there is, as it were, a coherent practice of interrogation, which anyone can do and necessarily will do on the basis of their own experience and concerns. And you can do that in relation to any bit of the history of ideas. I mean, so obviously some bits of it will be pretty much beyond your comprehension. I couldn't study Newton because I couldn't follow the maths, if you see what I mean. But, I could have had a try with the chronology of ancient kingdoms and some of his more bizarre ideas about chemistry and things like that. But anyway, I didn't want to study Newton, so it didn't matter because I couldn't study him. I was trying to understand Locke, and mostly I thought I could understand Locke, not always, of course, and quite often I couldn't actually read Locke. So I mean, you can't understand something you can't read. And although his handwriting was pretty good, I mean, it wasn't sort of consistently good, and he dictated quite a lot of his work to amanuenses, and of course their handwriting wasn't the same as Locke's, and sometimes was more illegible. So, and he also wrote quite a lot in shorthand, which I couldn't read at all. I could have taught myself to read it, but it wasn't really relevant to what I was trying to do, and the stuff that he wrote in shorthand. A lot of it had been deciphered, and some of it had been published, actually, but it wasn't important from my point of view, practically.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Perfect answer. Very interesting. You mentioned Quentin Skinner, Felipe, and I interviewed Professor Quentin Skinner. So now question about another great thinker about Cambridge tradition, John Popke, especially your recommendation from this interview. I read in some James paper. So Professor Dunn, my question is, in J.G. Popke and the idea of the Cambridge School and the history of political thought, St. James Ringelite Popke claimed that autonomy of the historian's method consists in the reconstruction of the paradigms or language within which political thought was articulated. In what on methodological inquiry, to what extent do you depart from this view? Do you think the Popke emphasis, on paradigms may sometimes lead to misinterpretations of political texts?
Well, I don't think it is actually thinking about paradigms which could lead you to misinterpret political texts, but it is very, very easy to misinterpret political texts. And actually, Pocock's interest in political texts was pretty different from mine. Pocock really was a historian's historian. And actually, Quentin is pretty much a historian's historian too. But I wasn't. I was only a historian by accident. So I was interested in what I was interested in. And I didn't actually find Pocock's method very, very interesting. And it was no use for what I was trying to do. And it was I thought it was rather ponderous, and that it wasn't actually particularly well calculated to pick up the distinctiveness of writing about politics, where, in a sense, the subject matter necessarily kicks back rather hard at the thinkers. So I thought you don't want to think of languages sort of flowing smoothly across the landscape of the past. You want to think about human beings saying things because of that they wanted to say for one reason or another, and saying them for whatever those reasons were. So it was continuously important. And the more interested you were in the politics, the more important it was to understand why they were saying them. And I thought going back to our Oxford contemporaries, very smart people, lots of them, I thought, well, their approach, it can't do that. I mean, it isn't trying to do that. It's not equipped to do that. And actually, it's, they're very, clever in dialogue with one another. But actually, they're liable to completely miss the people in the past they're talking about, because they're not really trying to understand the people in the past as those people happen to be. They're not trying to understand what prompted them to think about things they thought about and write about them in the way that they did. They're just not thinking really about them. They're thinking, I'm afraid, I would say, about themselves and about the political ideas which had come their way and which they could manipulate in a very clever way. I mean, they were competing in the perceptible cleverness of the way in which they could manipulate the ideas. And I just thought, well, what a silly thing to do, really. I mean, it wasn't silly in Oxford because that's what you did. But I thought, well, I'm very glad I'm not in Oxford, really. Now I've come to mention it. I'm still not desolate that I'm not in Oxford.
Perfect. Professor Dunn. Professor Dunn, I'm interested throughout your work, you frequently move between the story of ideas, political theory, and comparative political science. What principally differentiates the story of ideas from political science when both seek to understand political thought?
Well, I don't think political science is much use for understanding political thought. I think it depends for its political, whatever political illumination it manages to generate on prior political perceptions, and that those are necessarily to some degree parasitic on the history of political thinking. I mean, that's where they come from, and and so if you want to really understand politics, what you have to do is to get, as it were, upwind of those ideas. You have to understand what is happening in them and through them, and only that, because what's really important about political thought is what happens to political ideas in political use. I mean, that's why they matter.
Yeah, thank you. This next question is about a common critique that linguistic contextualism is used to receive, of being an antiquarian pursuit. That is, by strictly looking to see things their way, to quote Skinner, the historian risks abandoning the dialogical strength between past and present. Yet, opposed to these critiques, your own work has famously engaged with urgent contemporary issues, such as the nature of democracy, of modern revolutions, and the globalization of political thought. With that in mind, how do you navigate the methodological tension, if there is a methodological tension, between strict historical recovery and the need to address the political challenges of our own time?
Well, I don't think you can do them simultaneously in a coherent way. But I do think, and it's an increasingly aggressive conviction of mine, um, as the history of political thought comes under some competitive pressure from quantitative political science. I mean, simply in terms of employment and the listening time of students in universities, I've become increasingly belligerent about the perception I have, which I'm quite confident is right, that actually the way to learn to understand politics is by learning how to understand political thinking. And that political science is not actually an approach to that. I mean, it doesn't offer facilities for understanding that. You can't do political science, and the more sort of robustly behavioral and quantitative it is, I mean, the less you can do it without actually making a lot of implicit political judgments of your own. And what the history of political thought equips you to do is to think about those in a way in which you have some sense of viewing them not just compulsively from the inside, but actually intelligently from the outside as well. So I just think it is definitely intellectually upwind of political science as an overall intellectual practice for understanding politics.
Great answer. Professor Dunn, now I have a complex question about, sorry, my English, these just two words, it's difficult for me. Accents and the contingents. It's a common problem in metaphysics, political thought, story of ideas, political language. I find it particularly intriguing me that to synthesis and the million dialogue of the history of the Peloponnesian War, I think the book 4, I don't know, already appears to recognize the contingent character of political concept and laws in the context of ancient Greece. So my question therefore, Professor Dunn, it is, how should we understand the tension between existentialists and the contingents in contextual approach to ideas within this field of intellectual history? And in our view, is every form of existentialism ultimately mistake, or there is a defensible rule from some notion of essence in the study of political thought and historical ideas?
Well, I'm not a philosopher, so I don't use the category of essence in my own thinking, and I wouldn't really know how to. I mean, my interest in the history of political ideas is a practical interest in politics. I don't mean that I do politics professionally, but I think about politics as others do it professionally, and sometimes in a very amateurish way. But and I mean, the point of my thinking is to understand that better and to, in some sense, to take the measure of the amount of danger unleashed in it and the very limited potential it manages to achieve for sort of improving matters in the world. So my interest is, I mean, if I had to sort of pick a school of philosophy, I suppose I would probably pick some version of pragmatism, but actually there are lots of different versions of pragmatism, and I wouldn't know how to pick, from a philosophical point of view, the right one. I don't think from that angle, and I wouldn't, but I do think a great deal, and I think you could say, well, actually, I mean, the argument of the identity of the history of ideas is to quite a large degree about, I mean, the relation, if you want to put it that way, the relationship between essence and contingency. And it's an attempt to, in a way, to bypass that category structure in a way which is practical, in a way in which you can actually think for yourself and go on thinking coherently. So I would want to say, and I have recently said it quite bluntly, that I think the history of political thought across the world over the last 2,500 years or whatever has not been a complete failure, that there are some quite peremptory and deep lessons to be drawn from it. Well, I think that's rather essentialist as a sort of assertion. And I don't go around making it all the time. I mean, because it suddenly occurs to me that it's true. I just think, I should own up to the fact that I do think it's true. What is it's no use pretending that I think the lessons that have come out of it can be expressed in the form of self-evident truths, or truths which have been proved demonstratively. I mean, as Hobbes hopes, many truths about politics could be, or established beyond reasonable doubt by the history of the progress of science. I don't think it's like that in politics. I mean, politics is a moving target, and it's a very continuously and dynamically and erratically moving target. And it's absurd to think that you can just sort of get it and hold it. I mean, it's not available for holding. It goes on. So I don't think I'm either, a card-carrying essentialist or a card-carrying contingentist, if that's the opposite. But I think, and I think there's an ample supply of contingency, undoubtedly. But I think most of politics is contingency. I probably think more of politics is contingency than Machiavelli did, which is quite a long way out on the continuum. But I don't think there's only contingency. I think it is possible to deepen understanding.
Yeah, great answer. Yeah. This next question will be about the text you already commented, The Identity of a History of Ideas. It has been almost 6 decades since you published this article, and which is arguably your most famous methodological work, alongside with your approach in the political touch of Locke in in '69. Since then, you have published more than 20 books, over 100 articles, and numerous other academic contributions. How do you evaluate your methodological approach today compared to 1968? And do you see your subsequent work primarily as a continuous application of those original principles, or you have specific factors led to significant shifts in your thinking over the decades?
Well, I've thought about a lot of different things. And in 1968, I hadn't thought about anything like so many things. So, I don't think of that as being a candidate for an overall methodological approach. And actually, I'm not, you can have to be careful about how you understand this, I suppose, but I'm not particularly keen on methodology because, and especially educationally, I don't think methodology is, a rip-roaringly good thing. I mean, obviously, if you're dealing with statistical inference, you need methodology, but otherwise your inferences will be wrong. But actually, I don't think that thinking about politics is like that at all. I think, that's a pretty clean miss for thinking about politics. It can be very useful in finding things out about politics, but it's not a way of thinking about politics at all. I wouldn't say the identity of the history of ideas is a way of thinking about politics, but it was a way of thinking about the history of ideas. And I don't actually think there's something wrong in it. I think it's pretty much right still, as far as it goes. I don't think it goes, an amazing distance. It's not like a really powerful javelin throw. But I don't actually believe that there is a much greater distance to be gone, if you see what I mean. I don't have a conviction that if only you muscled up intellectually enough, you could produce something which would actually show people exactly how to think. I mean, if you, it might be right if what they wanted to think about was some sorts of subject matter, but politics is not at all that sort of subject matter.
So, perfect answer, Professor Dunn. Professor Dunn, I have a question. In the first chapter of Political Thought and History, Popek agrees that much of the vocabulary of Western political thought is deeply rooted in juridic language. This seems to suggest that the modern politics has always conceived through legal, constitutional, rhetorical categories, particularly in debates concerning the right, authority, and the legitimacy. In that context, how did English contextualism, both before and after Locke, contribute to shape the political language? The latter become associated with political liberalism.
Well, I think the main way in which it did so was through, in a sense, a historical sequence which you can think of the sources of quite well still through John Pocock's first great book, The Ancient Constitution and the Feudal Law. I think there's no doubt at all that the history of England particularly has marked very, very deeply what is now thought of as the history of liberalism, because of the history of representative institutions in England and the antiquity of that history and its pretty relentless insistence on continuity. Well, actually, what historians study and need to be able to study is to quite a significant degree continuity and discontinuity over time. And actually, of course, there's a great deal of discontinuity over time. But in the case of England, to a greater extent than in the case of Spain, for example, or Portugal, or France, or either bit of the Netherlands, or any bit of Germany, there is a historically connected sequence of political experience and political dispute centered on an institutional structure which does indeed go back a very long way. It's changed along the way, and obviously it's changed very, very deeply. And modern state, even a state as much disorder as the United Kingdom at the moment, is a very different sort of thing from England in the immediate aftermath of the Norman conquest, but or anything at all in the days of King Alfred. But it's still true that actually the way in which the English and quite a lot of other people who went to English, 100 years ago, or in some cases even 50 years ago, also now to some degree think politics, it is within that historical sequence and really doesn't have the same sort of imaginative force really outside that historical sequence. So when you take liberalism, as it were, whatever that exactly means, to China, for example, which does not have the same sort of imagined history as England has had, it's not at all clear what you're bringing, and it's not at all clear how it can fit with China. It's not clear that it's irrelevant to China. Far from it. I think a rather large percentage of the best educated people in China are relatively quiet liberals. I mean, they use the category themselves. They don't use it, as it were. They don't use it on their, CVs. It's not because it's a very dangerous thing to be in China at the moment. But they they do use it to distinguish themselves from those who certainly are not. And so it isn't a meaningless category when it gets to China, very far from it. But obviously, the way it works in China is very different from the way it works in, let's say, Spain or in England or in the United States or in Canada. The press is, however you understand it, it obviously works better than others, and times at which it obviously works better than others. So you have, politics is politics is really a contact sport, and it does move a lot.
Yeah. Now this next question will be specifically about your work on John Locke. In the political thought of Locke, you state that your aim was to provide an historical account to recover John Locke's own meaning, the reading which Locke himself would have wished to bequeath to posterity in the two treatises. You remark in its introduction, and I quote, "In a portrait gallery of history, Locke is a man who has worn many faces." You say that your special contribution to his interpretation was to stress the theoretical centrality of Locke's religious preoccupations in his work and subsequently in his definition of a state of nature, that challenges directly the myth of John Locke as a secular writer or as the supposed founder of a bourgeois individualism. Could you explain to us briefly how Locke's state of nature contradicts this myth right in its principle?
Well, the state of nature in Locke means the position of human beings in the created universe on the basis on which they had been created and which had made them what they were. And that basis was the creation of the universe by a divine, omniscient, and benevolent creator. And what human beings were like everything else in the universe, bits of the property of that creator. So that was the frame in which all Locke's arguments worked. I'm not saying that they all did work, but that's the way in which they were meant to work. That's the basis on which Locke claimed that they worked. And that was the framework in which Locke argued politically. Of course, Locke was a person engaged in politics, so he didn't continuously ask himself, what's God's view on all this? Should we assassinate Charles II or shouldn't we? What exactly should we do to organize the Church of England so that the level of internal religious conflict in the country is minimized? Or is that the right way to think about handling the Church of England? Should we handle it quite differently? Of course, he didn't think in that way when he was thinking practically, politically. But the two treatises of government, especially the second treatise of government, is a theoretical work. And Locke thought of it as such, and he argued that it was such. And that is the way in which people who mattered, who read it sort of later in the 18th century, when they really needed to think about it because of the political context in which they were acting, like Jefferson, for example, they read it as that sort of argument. And I think they read it correctly. And it was Whereas I think when it was, as it were, became a canonical liberal work, which is rather late actually in the history of political thought. It was basically late 19th century, really, in an academic setting when it acquired that sort of status. I think people didn't think about it that way. I mean, they just didn't really notice that that's what Locke said. But he does say it very explicitly. And he doesn't just say it explicitly in the published texts, he says it equally explicitly in his private papers when the composition manuscript of it and notes and so on that he wrote to himself. He thought about politics from one angle or another for a long time, and no moment in that did he think about it on different terms. So that was his view.
Perfect answer. Felipe, do you have comments about the answer, Professor Dunn?
No, yeah, I think it's a perfect one. Yeah.
Okay, Professor Dunn. I have a curious, perhaps in the future I research this, the relationship, the Iberian Road and the Anglophone Road, especially in political thought and political in general. So my question for you, given that the term liberalism itself first emerged the Spanish context of the early 19th century, right? How should we understand the respective contributions of the Anglophone and Iberian roads to the genealogy of liberal political language? And furthermore, to what extent did intellectual exchange between the Iberian world and English shape English political thought, particularly with regard to the language of rights, constitutionalism, and liberty?
Well, I don't think they actually shaped the English story to any great extent myself. I mean, it's of course absolutely right what you say, that liberalism as a term of political identification was an early 19th century invention, and I think it's right that it was first used in Spain. It was used quite soon afterwards in France by some people, but anyway, it's an early 19th century continental European label for a political position or a political orientation. It only became a term in active political use in Britain in the second half of the 19th century, and therefore it must have come by that route. But when it did become in active political use, it became in active political use in a context which, as I've tried to argue, you can see best of all by recognizing the longevity of Pocock's ancient constitution. I mean, we're still, I'm afraid, well, perhaps I'm not afraid, but anyway, I'm sure it's true. We're still inside the ancient constitution in the United Kingdom at this moment. The only time I've ever been inside 10 Downing Street was very shortly before the end of Gordon Brown's prime ministership, when his panic-stricken cabinet staff persuaded him that it was a good idea to consider the question of whether Britain should have a written constitution and to set about endowing it with one. Well, you could hardly have picked a less promising moment for trying to do that, even if you'd taken the whole period from 1066 till then. But so it wasn't a very instructive seminar. Some people said some very silly things in it. But I mean, it is quite important, really, that Britain hasn't ever had a written constitution. It has lots of text which are constitutional, but they're not one text. And so they have no internal, even sort of superficial internal order.
Yeah, great. Now we're entering in our last section of the interview. which is focused on some contemporary challenges and some contemporary perspectives. In your book, Breaking Democracy's Spell, you define democracy as, above all, formula for imagining subjection to the power and will of others without sacrificing personal dignity or voluntarily jeopardizing individual or family interests. But, as you note, any such formula is, as it has always been, precarious in political use. So, you propose that these formulas exert an imaginative pressure. What exactly is this imaginative pressure, and what is the task of an intellectual historian when analyzing these historical and philosophical phenomena with this imaginative pressure?
Well, I think the imaginative pressure is the effect on people's political sensibilities, the way in which they think about and feel about politics, and the historical process which has generated that effect. So you can't say, well, I mean, there are some academics who use these categories in quite a centralist sort of way. I mean, Charles Taylor, for example, uses the category of the social imagination. Well, I think the social imagination, it's a very, very plural thing everywhere, always, and it much depends on who you are, how you imagine it. And everyone imagines it rather differently. So I don't think of it as being a sort of I don't think of it as being a rigid structure. I think it has very little rigidity, and it's actually not that structural. But I think the idea of imaginative pressure is helpfully suggestive. It is true for everyone that the way in which they do see and feel political space depends on their experience, and their experience doesn't come, as it were, biologically just from inside their own body. It comes to them from lots of different angles over time as they learn their world. So you need to think about it in that kind of way. And that is actually quite a practical political point. It means that it's no use, as it were, riding into a country. I mean, this is important in the history of imperialism, and actually quite important in the history of sort of resistance to imperialism. You can't just ride into a country with the recipes for what that country should do, because you won't understand where you are, you won't understand what people feel, you won't understand how they think, and you are very likely to, and the more charismatic you are, the likelier you are to prompt them to do some things which will be an extremely bad idea there and then. So I think you need to recognize that people live in their own world, not in your world. And if you're doing the history of ideas, you need to keep that thought very prominent in your mind.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you.
Great answer. Professor Dunn, I would like to read a short passage from your book, The Senti, The People Free, The Story of Democracy. I try my best. I read it slowly because my English. So guys, let's go. As it travels through time and space, the word democracy never travels all its own. Increasingly, as the last 2 centuries have gone by, it has a traveling in fine company alongside freedom, human rights, and perhaps now even at the last transportation material, prosperity as well. But unlike these companies, democracies stake a claim which is disconcerting from this outset, the claim to be obeyed. So my question is, Professor John Dunn, reflecting your book, you agree that democracy never travels alone, and that from its very beginning, it has a claim to be obeyed. In the light of these two ideas, Could you say that today democracy finds itself traveling along a dangerous path where it is closing compassion, freedom, and human rights are under attack by anti-democratic forces like United Kingdom, Brazil, other countries seek to undermine its intrinsic claim, so to speak, to be obeyed?
Well, I think it's always been true that the claim to be obeyed is quite a precarious one. It's because you have to think of whom there is that you are being asked to obey and what it is that they have been doing. So you can't say, well, there's some way in which the category of democracy could have been applied, which means that it just is true that you should obey them. I mean, whether or not it's true depends on what they've done and what you reasonably surmise they're going to do. I mean, the idea of political legitimacy is a very ambitious idea. And if you want to be, sort of forensic about it, I think you should, you'll be hard placed to deny that actually it's an overambitious idea. It's an idea about how things could be if things were well at the time in the place in question. But actually, things very often aren't well in particular times and places. And so I think that it's not so helpful to think of that there might be some other and superior basis for legitimacy than the fact that a particular population which has been given an unconstrained opportunity to decide between candidates that have offered themselves to be governing a country for a bit. I think there's not some other basis on which their claim to be obeyed can be advanced with greater cogency. I don't think it's not true that there's a counter claim of greater force of the same generality, but it isn't. It's definitely not always a claim that should be taken seriously. It's a claim which you can completely, as a governing entity, you can completely forfeit the entitlement to. I mean, I think you don't want to think of it that way. I mean, supposing it were actually true that Adolf Hitler has run a smashing majority in 1933, I don't think that it would follow from that it was fine to go ahead and murder people on the scale in which he did. And I don't think it would make any more legitimate his launching war on other countries. I mean, I just think it's not. Political legitimacy is a sort of a first instance sort of thought, and it works when it works, but it often doesn't work. It's often been mislaid in particular times and places.
Yeah. Now coming to our last question for today. In 2013, you gave a lecture in memory of your colleague Sven Hond titled Why We Need a Global History of Political Thought, later republished in 2018. In that updated version of 2018, you argued that this necessity was also rooted in a more urgent non-academic context, the 2016 election of Donald Trump in the United States and a Brexit referendum in Britain. To give a brief perspective from our context in Brazil, 2016 was also a major turning point in Brazil, marked by the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff and the rise of a nationalist discourse throughout the country that eventually led to Jair Bolsonaro's presidency. In 2026, Brazil's upcoming presidential election still struggles with this strong nationalist discourse. Trump is again the president of the US, and the UK still deals with political instability, since Brexit, having gone through 7 prime ministers since then. Looking at this landscape, how do you feel the urgent necessity for a global history has evolved from when you first formulated it to our current moment here in 2026? And more broadly, how can the deparochialization of academic political thought contribute to addressing this wider crisis?
Well, the last I will leave firmly till the end, and you need to remind me of it, because they're a different sort of question. But the other questions are actually all, in a sense, political questions. In the first instance, I think it is essential for human beings across the world to learn to think about the implications of their mutual presence, because the human beings, not obviously all of them to an equal degree, but as a species, have made a very good shot at completely wrecking the conditions for their own existence. And it's not at all clear that can be. It is clear that they've done so to a degree in which life for human beings, most human beings in the world, is going to be very much more disagreeable for quite a long time to come than it's been for quite a long time before this. I mean, we are at a swing point from the point of view of collective experience, and it's, the swing is very fast, and it's not. I think it's that is a global problem. It's a problem for everyone. You can say, well, it's not so bad for Peter Thiel. He can go off and bury himself in New Zealand. The sooner the better. But actually, I mean, there are very few of him, mostly. And there are a lot of other people. And it's a pretty catastrophic state of affairs in the world at the moment. And there's no chance at all of the governments of different countries learning to cooperate better in the face of this appalling predicament, unless they recognize that they need to cooperate. There isn't anywhere that's safe. Actually, New Zealand isn't safe. It's just not like that any longer. It doesn't make sense to think in those terms. It is a really appalling fact. I mean, while we're on the general subject of the significance of the second presidency of Donald Trump, that what is still the richest large state in the world, and one which is actually in some respects becoming, however precariously, very much richer very fast. I mean, that could switch drastically at any moment, but it hasn't switched yet, and until it does, it's going to go on up that direction. It's an absolute catastrophe. The political leadership of that country has specifically withdrawn from the international agreement to try to do something about it. And actually, in my view, the only country in the world which is currently preparing to do something effective about it in a pretty long run, because it can't do enough about it at this point, is China. And I mean, that is a very important fact. But you can't think about politics, you can't think about political cooperation across the world without thinking about the terms in which not just the governments of China and the governments of the United States, but the governments of Iran and the governments of Saudi Arabia, and if I may say, the governments of Brazil, and the government of the Russian Federation need to cooperate together. Until they start doing so, or recommence at least pretending to be trying to do so. I mean, things are going to get blacker and blacker and blacker, and they're going to get blacker fast. So that's why it's urgent.
Perfect. Professor Dunn,
Yeah, perfect.
I have a question, personal question. What's your favorite books on English literature?
Oh, I'm not sure I
That's a
can answer.
difficult one.
Oh, actors. I like Shakespeare, Lord
Yeah,
Byron.
I might very well give you a number of sort of Shakespeare candidates, or I might give you, some novels, and those might. Yeah, but the novels might not be English. I mean, the thing is, it's quite. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm, well up in global literature, but I do stray beyond the British Isles, so that would be very difficult. You asked me one thing which I haven't tried to answer, which is, what does all this mean for the academic profession that studies the history of political ideas?
Yeah.
And I would say, well, what it mostly means is that it should do so on a different scale, and recognize that it needs to do so on a different scale for political reasons, not just because there is a different scale available, but because the needs of now, and still more the needs of the future. I mean, I have children. I have a 9-year-old daughter, so I mind about us sort of crashing the world. It's not all right from my point of view. So, and I don't think that the academic world has done at all well in the face of this. I mean, it's still true that you can leave any university in the world that I know of without actually having been taught just how dangerous things are, and at least some of the more coherent ideas about what could make them a bit less dangerous at a reasonable pace. So I mean, I don't think university education across the world is responding well to the urgency of the crisis. But insofar as it bears on historians of political thought, I mean, a fairly small proportion, after all, of the academic world, I think what it mostly means is that they need actually to pull themselves together and try to understand what it means that actually people in different societies who are living at the same time on the same globe think about politics and feel about politics very differently. And you can't understand that without thinking about how they've come to do so. And it's difficult to do that in a professionally serious way, unless they're societies which have had a reasonably long tradition of writing. So, I mean, it's a very complicated technical question about how to do it, and nobody has a clue how to do it so far. But I mean, I think they could get quite a lot of clues quite fast if they started trying to.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great last reflection for this interview.
Professor John Dunn, many thanks. It was a great pleasure to have this conversation with you. It was a genuine honor to pay a small tribute to your remarkable intellectual career, and nice to meet you. You're a great person.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jose. Professor Dunn, it was a truly valuable opportunity to speak with you today, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. And thank you very much.
I think you can probably tell that I enjoyed some of it. I didn't enjoy all of it because some of these questions are very difficult to answer coherently, perhaps beyond me. It's a very important conversation too. So thank you very much.
Many thanks.
Yeah, we thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Professor.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Nice.
Stop recording.
Yeah.